Hi, I looked at the article written by Edward Koo and Walter Sioki titled An Acoustic and Perceptual Study of Initial Stops, produced by profoundly hearing impaired adolescents. And they wanted to investigate how the voicing onset timing acts as a perceptual cue to the aspiration of the Cantonese initial stop consonants between the hearing and the hearing impaired. So those without hearing impairments produce the aspirated voiceless stops with longer VOTs and the unaspirated voiceless stops with shorter VOTs, and then those with hearing impairments produce the unaspirated voiceless stops with shorter VOTs, but then they also produce the aspirated voiceless stops with short VOTs. So with this information, they came up with the research question of how VOT and aspiration coincide to affect how aspirated and unaspirated initial stops are produced by those who have normal hearing and those who have hearing impairments. And then they also wanted to look at how people were going to perceive these differences in production, and if they could distinguish the difference between the aspirated voiceless stops and the unaspirated voiceless stops. So they took 10 Cantonese adolescents who didn't have hearing impairments and 10 that had profound hearing impairments, and had them record the production of these aspirated and unaspirated stops in word initial position. And then with these recordings, they presented them to speech and hearing science students at the University of Hong Kong, and to see if they could distinguish the difference between the aspirated voiceless stops and the unaspirated voiceless stops. The data was consistent with the information that was initially presented, that those with hearing impairments produced the aspirated voiceless stops with short VOT times compared to those without hearing impairments. They also found that for the perception identification of initial stops, the listeners were able to perceive the control group with 98% accuracy, so those without hearing impairments, but then for the hearing impaired speakers, listeners were only able to perceive these with 63% accuracy. So in conclusion, in order to more fully address the research question about how VOT acts as a perceptual cue to the aspiration contrast of initial stops, they used this data to show that because the accuracy was so much lower than those for the speakers who had hearing impairments and for those who didn't have hearing impairments, it shows that VOT does act as a perceptual cue in distinguishing these features. They also, and then with this information and other research they found that those with hearing impairments, because they can't acoustically distinguish between these sounds, it is suggested they are not able to self-monitor the VOT of the aspirated stops, and so therefore it doesn't act as a perceptual cue for the interpretation between these aspirated and unaspirated consonants. So limitations within the study, I believe, were the inconsistencies with the research question and the experiment to the results found about those with hearing impairments not being able to self-monitor the VOT. I don't think they actually matched up, and so I believe the next step would be taking this information and applying it to why those with hearing impairments are producing these aspirated voiceless stops with shorter VOT times, and this can be done by looking at the production of other consonants that differ in place, manner, and voicing for people with hearing impairments in order to find patterns that are consistent with this idea. And they can also look at how the environmental factors can be affecting this production, because those with exposure to people who are producing them with longer VOTs can maybe then develop a longer VOT time for the aspirated voiceless stops. And then, so my impressions about the article is that this information is beneficial, but if more extensive research is done, they can maybe determine, or extensive research is done about why there are these differences in VOT for the hearing impaired for aspirated stops, then maybe speech therapy programs can be coordinated in order to help with this production, and then people can increase communication because they'll be able to perceive these differences.